give yourself permission to not figure it out. I mean, I think it's really, really scary to go from feeling like you understand everything to feeling like you understand nothing.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Welcome back, everyone, for episode 32. My guest today is a poet and program director of Lit Literary Collective. She's also an associate poetry editor at Stirring, a literary collection, and Pittsburgh Poetry Review. She's on the advisory board of the Feminist Humanist Alliance, and she has two children, a 15-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl. She says that she's especially passionate about communication, emotional and spiritual health, and advocacy for victims and marginalized communities. In our interview, she discusses a traumatic experience that she had in a relationship. If you're a listener and this is something that is a sensitive subject for you, we wanted to let you know before the interview began. At the end of the interview, she talks about how she's drawn to joy. Considering her life circumstances, I find that very inspirational. I was able to get her thoughts on feminism and the Me Too campaign, and we discussed a lot of really interesting topics. I'm grateful that she made time in her busy schedule to share her story with us. I think you're going to be just as inspired by her story as I was. It was a pleasure to speak with her. Here's my interview with Krista Cox. All right, Krista, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
So before we jump into your story, I do like to hear a little bit about, there's a couple things specifically I want to ask you about, but is there anything that you're involved in or working on that you'd like to just talk about a little bit?
Sure. So I am involved in a lot of different things. I am a poet, and I write poetry. I also edit for Stirring, a literary collection, which is an online journal. And in my local area, I run a nonprofit organization called Lit Literary Collective, which supports local artists and especially literary artists. And we hold monthly events with a literary theme. I also am an advisory board member of the Feminist Humanist Alliance. I consider myself a feminist activist and also a humanist activist.
That's cool. Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to ask you about. Well, first of all, I love poetry and I don't read enough of it, but I discovered it when I was in high school, and it was just so weird because I was, sorry, this is getting off track early, but
go for it.
But no, like in high school, I was really into sports and stuff, and then I discovered, like my junior year of high school, I was in an English class and discovered poetry, and I was like, wow, I love this stuff. It's really, I don't know, it's really inspiring. I really enjoy it. So
yeah, I actually didn't get into it until just a few years ago. I went back to college in my early 30s, and one of the first classes I took was a gen ed that just happened to have a poetry component, and it just really sparked my interest. So
cool. So you've kind of been into it the last few years or last
yeah it hasn't been very long, but it's I jumped right in with both feet, so
that's awesome. Well, I was also going to ask you what got you interested in being a part of and maybe this is part of your story that we'll get into, but just briefly, what got you interested in being on the advisory board for the Feminist Humanist Alliance?
I actually am a fairly recent humanism convert. I considered myself agnostic for a very long time before I was a humanist, agnostic, then atheist, then humanist. And last year I attended the AHA conference, the American Humanist Association conference. Last year it was in Charleston. And my partner he encouraged me to go to the Feminist Humanist Alliance board meeting just because he thought I would be interested. I'm a strong advocate for women's rights, especially in the current climate. I think it's incredibly important, and I just really liked the passion that they had. You know, they were really interested in doing important things. They also really listened to their membership. There were people there from individual American Humanist Association chapters talking about, these are our concerns in our local area, and I watched the board actually take tangible actions to help them with those issues.
Oh, cool.
And I think that can be pretty rare. I mean, I think a lot of times communities focus a lot on philosophy and theory and can lose track of the more tangible actions that help people. And so I really appreciated that and wanted to be involved.
Yeah, the hands-on stuff. So you went to the American Humanist Association conference, and then maybe I missed it, but the Feminist Humanist Alliance is like basically just a subsidiary or like a side organization or something. I don't know what you consider it.
I forget the exact term, but it's like sort of an adjunct group, right?
Yeah.
They're related and not necessarily part of, but certainly interrelated. I mean, we have the same goals in a lot of ways, so it makes sense to work together.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, why do you call yourself a humanist? What would you say to that question?
Well, I think that I've always been a humanist. I mean, it's just that I didn't have a word for it until I met this community of people who just happen to, hold all the same values and beliefs that I do. I appreciate that they focus on becoming the best humans that we can be, both individually and as a species. I like that they have a heavy focus on science and empirical knowledge. And goodness and compassion and growth and all of these things are things that have been very important to me for at least the last 20 years when I moved into adulthood. So it just made sense to start identifying that way.
Cool. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, there's a lot of things about like being a humanist or being. My wife is a pretty big feminist, and she kind of exposed me to that and kind of got me into that. And you realize that feminism is just equal rights. Humanism is just equality for all people, and it's like, oh, who can't get behind that? I mean, there are people, but, most of us can kind of get behind that.
Find a way, but yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into your story. So in what ways did Christianity influence your childhood?
The family that I grew up in could probably best be described as inconsistent. My parents, for most of my childhood, were not actually extremely religious, but my grandparents on both sides were. And so I think that they cared a lot that I, went to Sunday school and church every single Sunday. I was raised Lutheran, Missouri Synod, which I understand. I don't know much about it, but I understand is, the more Catholic of the synods. But so I did go to Sunday school and church, and I was confirmed when I was 13. And, all the while my parents were making me go, but not really very religious until I think I was in 8th grade or maybe freshman year of high school. They had a born again Christian experience. The story that they told was that they both, they had a lot of marital problems and, personal problems. And they said that they bolted awake in the middle of the night at the same time, and they had both been dreaming about fighting with the devil. And
wow.
Yeah, very, very dramatic stuff. And to be fair, I watched them change as people very suddenly. I mean, they definitely did undergo some sort of transformation, and it seemed to make them much happier and calmer. And it didn't last. It lasted probably a year or two. But in seeing that transformation, I sort of felt I did feel moved by that. And I was very devoutly religious all throughout high school.
Was it your parents' conversion, or they were already Christian, but was it that experience that they went through and seeing their lives transformed that kind of inspired you?
I think that was a big part of it. I mean, I think that I was just presented one set of facts. These are the facts. This is the way that the world is. And it always, Jesus was real and God was real. And, this is how you behave. And so, I didn't even know that there was another potential set of facts out there, but I wasn't really like living dogma or principle, so much as just living within that set of facts until I did see that transformation. And then it did inspire me this sort of desire to please God, because look what God will do for you if you just make him happy and follow his rules. And so, yeah, I mean, you could certainly say that was an inspiring event for me.
Yeah. So you said you were really devoutly religious all through high school. So maybe describe that transformation and kind of what that was like for you, how that played out in your life.
So I grew up in a very small town in Wisconsin, and there was practically zero diversity. It was, I don't even know if it wasn't a very political place. We didn't really talk about politics ever. And like it happens to a lot of people when they go off to college, I was exposed to things that I'd never had any exposure to before. I can remember, one of the first week there, I saw 2 girls kissing in the stairwell, and I just was flabbergasted. Like, I didn't even know that was an option. Like, oh my God.
How could that be happening? What is this?
I don't understand. Yeah. So,
That's funny.
and it was very confusing, because it went against this set of facts that I'd been given, and I didn't, I mean, they were nice women. They weren't, I couldn't manage to demonize them, quickly enough to not let doubt start to seep in. And so I kind of just shelved all of that for a couple of years. But so in my desire to please God, I didn't drink, until I was 21, and I still didn't drink very much after that. And I don't think I swore. And the big thing was that I was going to be a virgin until I was married, or at least the technical version, because, God only cares about P and V sex. Everything else is fine, right?
Yeah,
so, yeah, it's no big deal. So I could fool around, but no intercourse until I'm married. That's a special and saved.
Yeah.
And I was really proud of that decision. I don't remember being, in any way like forced to take a virginity pledge or anything like that. Like it didn't feel like a coercive thing. It felt like something I decided and I owned, and I was very proud of it. And my self-worth was very tied up in, my purity and my strength. This was a display of strength to hang on. I mean, because it's not like I didn't want to have sex. I'm a human being. I totally did.
Right.
And I didn't.
It's the culture. It's the people around you are praising that type of those virtues or values.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I did not have intercourse until I was 20 years old. And when I was 20, I met a man named Chris, and we dated for about a month. And at least before this happened, and it was very clear, I was very vocal about who I was and where I stood in this stuff, and so he knew, and he didn't care. He was a nice enough guy at first, and then one night we were fooling around or whatever, and he just decided we were going to have sex. And so that was how I lost my virginity. And I would love to say that I woke up, that was my, waking up point. But really what happened was I had a complete mental break. I didn't identify it as rape until many years later. After, years and years and years of processing, what I believe happened was that, I'd spent my whole life thinking I was going to be with one man ever, because that was what God wanted and needed and expected. And so I was with this man, whether it was my choice or otherwise. And so this must be the man that God intended me to be with.
Wow.
None of it was conscious, at the time. In fact, my personality just kind of shut off after that happened. But I mean, I think I talked to my mom on the phone, just, some innocuous conversation, like a week later. She didn't recognize me. She's like, I don't understand. I don't even know who I'm talking to right now. You don't sound like yourself at all. I stayed with Chris for 4 years after that.
And you said you'd only known him about a month when this happened, or you'd only been together a month? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd only known. He was a random stranger I met when I was waitressing, and so I'd only known him for a month.
And then you talked about kind of assuming a role, almost like you kind of went into like autopilot. Maybe is that a good way to describe it?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, it was like all of my mental defenses just switched on, and I couldn't handle the gravity of what had happened, especially not given the fact that like I had just lost everything that I had stood for. I had associated all of my value with this purity and this worth, and it was gone now. And so I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what was important anymore. I didn't know how to start rebuilding from that. And also, very shortly after this, probably unsurprisingly, Chris became emotionally abusive. And so he just, reinforced this idea that I was worthless now and nobody else would want me. I was tainted and so, it was impossible for me. Leaving never even occurred to me. I mean, this was just my life now.
Well, yeah, because it's like if you stay with the person who did that to you, in a way, it almost like if things worked out, then maybe it would have been like, in quotes, like okay,
right,
or something,
right,
yeah,
yes, it was like a trial that I had to go through, right? I had to fix this terrible relationship, and that was like kind of like my parents did, to be honest. I mean, I don't think I really made this connection until now, but they had this terribly fraught interpersonal relationship with one another, and then one day they just woke up together in God, and everything was fine for a while at least. And so, there's probably a part of me that expected that if I just held on long enough, I'd have my middle of the night, wake up, born again moment.
Things will just get better.
I'll just be fine. This is God's plan. It wouldn't have happened if it wasn't in his plan.
Yeah. So you were talking about him starting to become emotionally abusive and acting in that way. So what happened at that point?
Well, I got pregnant very, very shortly after. I think we had been together for only 4 months when I got pregnant. He didn't like condoms, and he took advantage of me financially, and so I was in this position where I couldn't afford birth control. Not having sex wasn't an option for him. So I got pregnant, and abortion was also another thing that was just not even on my radar. It never occurred to me to even consider it. I don't think I would have made that decision either way, but thinking back, it's like I didn't even think about it.
Didn't even have that option. Yeah.
No. And so, I was with him until our son was about 2 years old. And at that point, he started to become emotionally abusive to our son as well. And that was when the switch flipped back. I just woke up one morning, packed everything and left. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't, it was just, I saw how he was treating our son. And it was fine for him to treat me that way because I deserved it. I was this dirty, horrible whore, but I knew he didn't. And so I just left.
Those instincts kicked in, those parental instincts. That's really, I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm so grateful for the way because who knows, I could have stayed forever probably.
Yeah.
I don't know what else could have been a catalyst to leaving.
And you were with him for, did you say 4 years about? Or?
It was about 4 years.
Okay. Yeah. And so you have a young, a young child, and you moved out. Where did you go? I got an apartment. I was 22, 23 maybe at this time, something like that. But I had a good job, so I was very lucky. I lived in Indianapolis at the time, and I was working at this law firm that was very, very supportive. It was relatively small, and they treated me like family, and so I got a lot of support there, which was wonderful. That's awesome.
And not long after, I actually met my second husband, who really helped, to raise Caden, my son, and he was very, very generous with his time in that regard. So that happened. And, as far as the deconversion, I wasn't religious, obviously, during any of this, but I also wasn't non-religious. Everything just stayed on that shelf that it had been put in. And I didn't have the strength to wrestle with any of it until, my late 20s, really. That was when it kind of came back into my life, when I started to deal with the things that had happened to me.
And it was just probably too painful to deal with it up to that point? For the years during and after.
It was impacting my life. And I still hadn't even acknowledged that I'd been raped. It was just, some bad decisions I made. And there was tons and tons of self-loathing and just this complete lack of understanding of like how I could stay, and I couldn't comprehend what had happened until I entered therapy for like completely unrelated reasons. I was having some problems in my marriage or something. And I went to therapy, and she said, we probably should talk about that.
Yeah, like that's kind of important. Yeah.
Kind of a big deal. Yeah. And so when I did, that was when I figured out, how much, my virginity had been tied up in what had happened, and, that loss and my beliefs about God, wanting that for me. And pretty quickly after that, once I made those connections, I went through a phase of just, anger, just furious at religion and at my family and, at the culture that had taught me these things about where my worth came from and what men were entitled to. And so I was, the angry atheist for, at least probably 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. So you would say up until the point when you kind of transitioned out of being religious, you would have described yourself maybe as like a kind of a marginal Christian, or just kind of it wasn't a big part of your self-identity then during that time?
No, not at all. It just wasn't even on the radar. I mean, I probably, if people asked, I would have said I was Christian.
Yeah.
Just being, culturally Christian or whatever. But I just didn't think about it at all.
And then up to the point when your views started to change, what else was significant up to that point in your life that you feel is important to your story?
Kind of just this general sense of feeling incredibly lost, and unable to find myself too. I mean, I really struggled with that. And I didn't feel like, because I'd been just handed this set of facts when I was growing up, I wasn't given any critical thinking skills. I didn't ever need them because everything was spoon fed, right? And, even into my late 20s, I didn't have that. So I didn't really have the ability to, try a thing on and say like, oh, does this feel like me? And yes or no, or any of that. I was almost an automaton. I was just, moving through life without really any processing happening.
But I think a lot of people do that. I mean, I think that's really common for a lot of Christians. I mean, a lot of people in general. I mean, we just grow up in the family we grow up in. We grow up in the culture that we grow up in, and you go through life and.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you're absolutely right. I think it's probably more common than the alternative, but once I did start developing a sense of self, it became very clear that that's not, I'm not that way at all. I'm an incredibly self-reflective person, really invested in personal growth. I have a very strong sense of identity. And, I suspect if I had been raised differently with more tools and less facts, I would have been this person all along,
Yeah, it was a black and white world, and then you realized it was gray.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, can you identify was it during that time in your life when you were going through therapy and kind of starting to process this stuff? That's when you said the doubts about your faith or about God started to kind of creep in, or? Yeah.
So there was therapy, and there was dealing with, the situation that had happened with my first husband. And then there was also, oddly enough, I have to give a lot of credit to this online forum called, it was Indie Moms. It was like a mom's group for women in Indianapolis. And, there had to have been, hundreds of women on this news forum. And we would just talk about all kinds of things. I mean, mostly it was about recipes and diapers and crap like that. But occasionally there would be really intense political conversations. And it was there that I really started to be able to figure out, to hash out who I was and what I believed. And sometimes there would be really intense religious discussions too. I mean, I'm in Indiana. It is a pretty conservative religious state,
Yeah.
But there is a small, especially in Indianapolis, there's a contingent of, non-religious, democratic, liberal sorts of people. And so, they would butt heads. And in that butting of heads, I got to look and see like, here are these two sets of facts, at least two, probably a lot more than two, and I get to pick now. And so, that was really, those political conversations were really formative for me. That was really the first time I ever got to, and I just have such a talent for debating that I never knew I had before. So it really started to feel like I had an identity, at least on this forum. It took some time to translate that into a real life identity. But that was it was a really big deal.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like that was a really significant time in your life for personal growth and finding out who you really were inside. Like, it's starting to come out now, and you're starting to see it's almost like it feels right. Like this is the path you were supposed to take. Like, you're learning about yourself. And
Yep. And I think that was kind of when I, while I was starting to figure that stuff out, I identified as agnostic.
Okay.
Because I just didn't know, and I was still collecting data.
And you were still a single mom at this time?
No, actually, I married my second husband in like 2006, so a few years after I had left my first husband. And we were together about 8 years. We divorced in 2012. Okay. So I was not a single mom. I was married at that point.
Okay. And then, so when you became agnostic, when you knew you weren't Christian anymore, did you tell anybody? Were there any problems with your family when they found out that you?
I don't know if I've ever had a conversation with my family about my religious beliefs.
That's funny.
I mean, interestingly, my parents went through the whole born again phase, and then it stopped working, or for whatever reason, and they just kind of, I mean, they were really crazy religious for a while. I mean, I remember they wouldn't let us, we couldn't celebrate Halloween because it was the devil's holiday. But yeah, they just let go of it. I mean, they just they moved on to the next thing, I guess. We were never very, deep people. I mean, we never really had very deep conversations anyway. So it wasn't like, it was pretty informal most of the time. So no, we never really talked about it.
What about your husband at the time? Was he a religious person?
He was not. No. Okay. He kind of didn't care about it either. So I don't think he identified as anything. It was very helpful. I didn't have to fight him on that front. So
yeah. And then like you're at that time you only had one child, or had your second child?
We had a daughter about a year after we married. So okay. I had my son who I don't know how old he would have been then. Now he's 16 and my daughter is 10 now.
Yeah, I have a 15 and a 14-year-old. Well, both boys. So
yeah,
it's fun.
It is an interesting time.
It is an interesting time. Yeah, a lot more time. They don't spend as much time with you.
That's right.
That's what you learn, Uh-huh. Well, so you become agnostic, and then you said that you transitioned into atheism. What provoked that transition?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think on the one hand, I just collected enough data and none of it pointed to God. And so it just made more sense to stop being wishy-washy about it. For me, I think, in some respects, I kind of admired the conviction of atheists, I guess, and to like really have, this is, although to be fair, almost all of the atheists I know are very open. If they find new evidence, they're like, hey, but given the evidence I have, I just really don't think this is real. So,
yeah.
And agnostic's it doesn't really say anything to me, I guess, anymore. I mean, it's not so different really from atheists, because like I said, most of the atheists I know would be open to new evidence. And that was kind of all I was trying to say when I was agnostic. It's like, I don't have enough information, So yeah, and I started to feel just sort of firmer in my sense of identity in other ways too, and so taking a firmer stand with regard to the fact that I just really didn't believe that there was a God was probably part of that gelling of the rest of my self-identity.
Were you discovering feminism at this time, or did that come later?
Oh, that came later. Actually, I'm not sure. I was a feminist, certainly, but I didn't really start caring about that stuff until I divorced in 2012 and started dating again. And of course, the last time I was dating in like 2004, there was not online dating, really. It was not, kind of, but not really. And, in 2012 everybody dates online now.
Yeah, now it's like super common.
It is, and it's terrible. Oh, it's the worst.
Oh no, I've heard that from coworkers. They've said things like that, like, "You're so lucky, Steve, you're not doing that. Like, it's horrible."
Yeah, I don't know how the experience is for men, but for women, it is brutal. It's just brutal. It is, you just get constantly exposed to men's most baser instincts, and I found myself spending so much time trying to figure out like what I was doing to invite this stuff, like. Well, I answered the sex questions honestly. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe it's just inviting people to, be gross with me. But then, I deleted all the sex questions, and I was very modest on my profile. I didn't even make any jokes about blowjobs or anything like that. But I had a profile picture that was me eating some mashed potatoes, and I had the fork in my mouth, and, and some guy said, "Man, would I love to be that fork." And I just was done then.
You're just like, I can't even take a picture of me eating food.
That's right. And then I posted it on Facebook, bitching about the guy. And somebody said to me, like, well, you really should have seen that coming. I mean, if you draw any attention at all to your mouth, it's like, oh. And it was a woman. It wasn't even a guy. And so...
It's a cultural thing. I mean, that's what my wife's really been good about pointing out to me, is that it's not just... Like, there's a book called it's called Female Chauvinist Pigs. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but written by a feminist, clearly. And she just talks about how that culture's kind of, it's with women too. I mean, obviously you know this, but it was really fascinating to me to hear about, and read these stories of women reinforcing these horrible things. Yeah.
Oh yeah, we're all in the same bathwater. So
yeah. So that's when you kind of start to learn about or consider yourself a feminist, or...
It's when I think what it was is that was when I really made the connection between these small, seemingly innocuous behaviors and the larger problems of patriarchy and the abuse of power and discrimination in the system, because a guy saying a gross comment, it seems like an isolated incident, right? But it just really started to become clear. And I suffered more trauma in the dating scene. It all came into really sharp focus. And it really honestly got to the point for me where, I would try to talk to men all the time about feminism and about equality and things like that. And if they could not see my perspective, I couldn't date them. I just, because it felt like the distance between, well, I really don't think there's discrimination in the workplace against women, and I feel entitled to your body, just closed right up for me. To me, those things sounded like the same thing. Mm-hmm. And it just, I got very concerned about my safety, especially considering everything that I had been through. And I was in this seemingly very risky environment. Yeah, I closed up quite a bit. And I got incredibly intolerant of even, small misogynies.
Well, I think it's a bad sign in general if you're talking to someone who you want to build a relationship with on any level, and they don't seem receptive to your point of view, or they don't seem tolerant of your thoughts, or your, what you're expressing. That's just not a good sign.
Oh, that's absolutely right. Being right is more important than, understanding the other side of you or whatever.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Well, you don't have to answer this question, but I'm just curious about your thoughts on having experienced trauma in your past. What are your thoughts on all this stuff going on, like in the public eye with the Me Too campaign and all this stuff? Do you have any thoughts on that or
I have so many thoughts.
Well, tell me your thoughts. I mean, I want to know.
I'll tell you everything.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it's really beautiful to see women being heard, and really important, and it feels so validating. And we've been saying these things for decades and decades, and it's really uncomfortable for me when men say oh, we're not allowed to flirt now, or oh, the rules have changed, or because it's no, I mean, these have always been the rules. It's just that we care about enforcing them now, and we're finally getting some traction in actually getting these rules followed. I really hope that there's just this lasting perspective shift in seeing women as people, and understanding that it's not good guys and bad guys. It's not, and I think a lot of times men feel very defensive about the current environment because, oh, I'm a good guy. I don't do anything wrong. But like we were talking about earlier, well, we're all part of this same system, right? And there's lots of ways to harm someone without intending to harm someone. And so I hope it does raise this level of awareness of people's own behavior. I had a friend who was in a situation where he was moderating a poetry reading, and there was a heckler who was heckling. It was actually all female, all women poets reading, and this guy was heckling the women poets. I don't like what you're talking about, whatever. And my dear friend was torn between what to do, because on the one hand, he wanted to intervene and not let these women feel unsafe or threatened in any way. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, he wanted them to know that he thought that they were capable, and he didn't want a white knight, he didn't want to be a savior. Mm. And I think that those are both valid perspectives. And it's very likely that in either case, one of the women could have been upset. I was really upset that you stepped in there because, we can handle this. And I was really upset that you didn't step in there because I felt unsafe. And, the place that he came to ultimately was that the women's feelings were what mattered, not if he did the right thing, right? And so, it did happen that, someone was, didn't like the way that he had handled it. And instead of, well, I thought about it and I couldn't, it was a lose-lose situation. It was just, I'm sorry that you felt unsafe. I want to help you feel safe. What can I do differently next time? And, so I think I love the idea of, what women need being part of this ongoing dialogue. Yeah. And men not being afraid to ask, what do you need? Which is complicated because, and this is the, I said on the one hand, I'm thrilled about it. On the other hand, it is very complicated And it's often very confusing. And from one perspective, there's no nuance. It's like there's right and there's wrong. Don't do the wrong things, and you need to be held accountable if you've done the wrong things. On the other hand, I hope that we settle in a place where there is more nuance, where nuance is welcomed and allowed, and where, it does open conversation.
Yeah.
I think men have had plenty of time to talk, and they should be fine with just shutting up for a while. A good long while, I think, would be fine,
It's just this whole idea of like, just let them be heard. Like, let the women be heard.
Yes.
Like, this has, on one hand, it has nothing to do with guys. Like, in some sense, it's more about women having the opportunity to talk, share their story, and have people hear them and not comment on it. Just hear the story, hear the experience. On the other hand, obviously, it has a lot to do with men and the entitlement and the behavior.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the main place I don't want nuance to be lost is in, I don't want it to be black and white, good guy, bad guy. I want it to be black and white, good behavior, bad behavior, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that we tend to turn rapists or assaulters into these monsters in our minds, and I think that the effect of that is at least twofold. On the one hand, it allows us to distance ourselves from that. Oh, I could never do that. That person is this unique kind of evil, and I could never do anything that hurts a person that way. And on the other hand, for me at least, it helps me feel safer, because if I can recognize the monsters, then I know who's safe, right? But I think that it's so much more complicated than that. Anyone is unsafe, in the right circumstances. And lots of these people who do really horrible things. The guy who raped me, lots of people loved him, and his mother thinks he's great. And he's not, it's like the neighbor that nobody saw the mass murders coming because he was just the nicest, quietest guy, But that's because there's no conflict in being a nice guy and also being a rapist.
I think that's the thing that's shocking to me too, is hearing all these actors and all these famous people and going, I thought that guy was a good guy. Like, I thought he was on our side. I thought he was on the side of right, But then you realize, no, he can be a nice guy, super charismatic, hilarious, fun to be with, and also be abusing women and taking advantage or raping or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think the conversation about consent is so incredibly important, because I think that as a culture, we have really, really, really confused ideas about it. It seems like, somebody tweeted something ridiculous about can't I even hug women anymore? And it's like, it's so easy to ask for, may I hug you, And of course there's, it does get a little more complicated because, maybe I don't feel coerced into that hug. Maybe I don't feel safe saying no. And that's a real thing we have to talk about too. But even just, the idea that just asking is, talking to my son, who's 16 now, we've had lots of conversations about consent over the years. And the ideas that he's gotten from somewhere, I don't know where, certainly not me, but, the vast web of the internet, will, just ask her can I do this? Well, won't that kill the mood? And I think that that's a really common thought,
Especially for a teenage boy.
Right. It'll kill the mood. But imagine for the woman how it's going to kill her mood if you do a thing to her she doesn't want done. Whose mood are we protecting here?
And even the asking her, if the woman feels pressured or threatened, she might go along with it to just survive or just get through. And that's something that because, you think oh, well, if you ask them, they say yes, then it's fine, but it's maybe not. Maybe you need to be cueing into the body language. And you know what? Maybe we just play it safe, or whatever. It's just, like you said, it's so nuanced. It's, they're sometimes really difficult waters to navigate, the whole thing.
Yeah. And I think that everyone involved needs to have a really, focal or an aware focus on the power imbalance, and the way that our is set up to, it's like, riverbanks, we're meant, we're set up to go in a certain direction. And, you do really have to make sure. I mean, you owe it to both of you to make sure that you're really going somewhere that you want to go.
Yeah.
My boyfriend always says, that he's not looking for a yes. He's looking for a yes tomorrow morning, right? Like if you're not still saying yes tomorrow morning, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, when you think back on, the person that you were kind of growing up younger as a Christian, being really devout, what do you think about that person now when you look back at her?
Oh, I just feel really sad for her. I mean, I was thinking a lot today. I've been focusing really hard in my life lately on developing compassion for other people. I think that, in this climate, the political climate especially, there's so much nastiness coming to the surface. I struggle really hard with not just writing people off, and they just suck. And, it's best if we just build our own little tiny, tight-knit circles and forget everybody else. But there's something in me that pushes against that. And, honestly, I find it so much easier to do that outside of a religious context. I think that there are lots of potential goods in religion. I think that, on one level, it's trying to bring people together. It's trying to encourage people to have charity and show gratitude and be compassionate. But it goes wrong somewhere. It's too prescriptive. And I don't know that, that those things work in a prescriptive way. But I do think that it's really, really important that we are more connected than we are, that we are more loving and compassionate with one another. I was never able to get anywhere close to that in a religious context. I just felt like there was too many things forcing me to focus on what I should and should not be doing to allow me to even think about other people, really. I mean, it's a very me-focused kind of thing. And I think, a lot of people go into religion out of fear because there's so much uncertainty in the world. And there's so much, that seems to need an explanation. And I wish that it were what it promised, I guess.
Yeah.
I wish it had been what it promised for me, and it was not. It derailed. It took me a decade. I mean, I still am not really past anything that happened. I mean, it definitely informs everything still, I mean, everything gets processed through that filter now. And it's unfortunate. I spent a lot of time and energy having to work through the hurt, the harm that those religious beliefs caused me.
Yeah. Well, what's something that you've learned or experienced now that if you were still a Christian, you may not have?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I found so much fellowship, I guess, amongst. If I were still a Christian, I would not be a vehement feminist. I can't imagine that I would be an activist. I can't imagine that I would be aligned politically, as I'm very far left. And I can't imagine a world in which those things were true about me and I was a Christian. And I genuinely feel that, I'm making change in the world. It's on a tiny scale, and I'm just part of a much larger machine that's, hopefully getting things done. But I never managed to feel bigger than myself when I was a Christian. Nothing in that made me feel, I mean, everything was kind of designed to make me feel small, original sin and the vastness of God. And I really do feel part of a community now. And I admire so many people in this community.
You mean the humanist community or just the different various communities you're a part of?
Yeah, the various communities that I'm a part of. I mean, honestly, like the poetry community is also a very activisty, feministy community, generally speaking, or at least the corner of it that I have found myself in. And, I mean, the reason that people are doing art and creating is because they care. They care about the world and they care about people having voices. And so there's just a passion. There's a passion in my life and in my relationships that did not exist when I was a Christian, and I can't imagine it having existed.
That's interesting. So do you think that from what you're saying, I've actually heard the opposite from a lot of people, that they left the community of church and that was a big hole in their life, the community piece of it. And you're almost saying that religion made you feel small, the vastness of God. And now you feel better and more like part of something.
Yeah, well, it's not without a lot of work. I mean, I do think that, like I said, community is one of the benefits of religion. And I do think that there are a lot of non-religious people who are seeking community. And it can feel very isolating because you don't have this place that you go every week to spend time with people. But I made a very deliberate effort, right, to find a place where I felt, I worked really hard to figure myself out, and then I worked really hard to figure out where I belonged. And who else was like me, and to kind of replace that community that I had lost, or at least even the potential of a community that I'd lost when I left religion. But I mean, I think there are a lot of resources out there. They're not always the easiest to find, but I mean, there's lots of, regular humanist meetings and, people doing, great things together.
I think that's really good advice to say that it wasn't, that your response immediately was, well, it wasn't without a lot of work. And I actually think that's really good advice because it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of self-reflection. And especially if you've transitioned out of something as significant as Christian culture and now you're transitioning into being an atheist or a humanist, it takes a lot of work. I think a lot of people who've deconverted would associate with, how big of a move that is and shift is in your life. So that's good to tell people, because hopefully people who are deconverting, well, I know there are people who are deconverting that are listening to this podcast. And so it's really good for them to keep that in mind. Like it's a big transition. It's going to take time. It's going to take work. And, but that, the end of that road is really, really positive. You find the community that you're part of, you find your people, so to speak. So anyway, I think that's really good advice to tell people who are kind of going through this thing right now.
Well, and I think there's a greater genuineness of connection in the communities that I find myself in now because I've chosen them or created them. I mean, part of the reason that I started Literary Collective was because, the artists in our area are disconnected from one another. And, we shouldn't be. It's a really wonderful opportunity we have, similar interests and values in some ways. And, we should come together. And so, I mean, I was raised in a religious community, but the only thing I really had in common with those people was that we were, we believed in God. Yeah. But now I've created so many other communities where, there is this deeper core of connection that I have created.
Yeah.
And so it has been much more valuable to me.
That's great. Well, when you think back on that, that Christian upbringing and how different, how different that is from who you are today, that's a big change, right? To go from a Christian to a humanist, or it can be a big change. What about you through all of that stayed the same? Something positive about yourself that you can see in the early years and is also true of you today?
Well, I think that, I think that I am drawn to joy. I feel like I've been I find reasons to be joyful. I mean, I can remember, feeling very glowy in my faith when I was in high school. That feeling of joy when you're so happy that you feel like it's just coming off your face. Like
that's awesome. I love that.
That is my favorite feeling. And so that's, and I think that's very lucky that I feel inclined to at least finding that. I don't think it like spontaneously exists necessarily, but, and I've always been a very, very, very hard worker, probably too hard. I'm not necessarily a workaholic, but I always have to feel like I'm working on something, And before, I guess when I was a Christian, what I was working on was following the rules and making the hard decisions. And, over time it's evolved into like being emotionally healthy and making myself better and helping other people. And, but I haven't stopped working hard. I probably will do that until I skid into my grave.
I love that, though. Drawn to joy, find reasons to be joyful. That's great. So there's someone listening to this podcast who's going through deconversion right now or is just deconverted. When you think about that person, what encouragement or piece of guidance can you give them?
give yourself permission to not figure it out. I mean, I think it's really, really scary to go from feeling like you understand everything to feeling like you understand nothing. And I say this from a place of, this is one of my main struggles, is embracing the uncertainty of life. I mean, it's always better to not know than to be positive and wrong.
Yeah.
It's way, way less comfortable though.
Absolutely.
And it's going to be. And the more you can like accept that discomfort instead of struggling against it, just be like, okay, I don't know what the hell's going on. That's okay. Like, it's going to be uncomfortable for a while, but that's okay too. It actually eases that discomfort, the coming to acceptance of just the way that things are going to be a little sketchy for a while. And start doing stuff. It doesn't have to be like, you don't necessarily have to go out and find a specifically non-religious community to become a part of, but start exploring yourself and go out and do things that you think you might be interested in. And that's a really good way to start building community and start feeling like a part of something. Because I think that's another thing that people tend to lose a lot, feeling like a part of something.
Yeah, that's excellent. And what I was thinking of when you were saying that is just, by being okay with not having figured it out, by being okay with not figuring it out, you're almost embracing that human experience. This is just something that we go through, right? Mm-hmm. Like as people, we don't know everything, and sometimes we get like the rug pulled out from under us, things change, and we don't know what to do, and that's part of life. And I think that's good advice to just say, what, settle in and be okay. Just be okay with where you're at.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So is there one resource that you could recommend for someone who is deconverting from Christianity?
Oh, that's tricky because when my deconversion was it lasted so long and it went through so many stages and it was relatively informal. So I wasn't necessarily seeking out resources.
I actually think what you just said was really good about even non-religious communities. To join those communities, things that you're interested in. I think that's actually a really great resource. I mean, because people who've been just plugged into the church for everything, when that plug's taken out, it's like, well, what do I do? Where do I go? Well, if you start doing kind of what you talked about, learning about yourself and going through that process, then you can begin to find these things like a poetry group or a feminist group or whatever, I think those were great options, as far as resources too, even though they're not specifically atheist,
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I mean, I'm a huge fan of things that help you learn about yourself, right? And so there's lots and lots of different ways to do that. I personally love self-helpy books. Like I love Brene Brown, and right now I'm reading the Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which seems weird. I mean, they're very, spiritual people, but there's a lot to be found in there that has nothing to do with religion. And I'm always reading a book like that, and I love them. I think that, at the times in my life when I did not have community, becoming very intimate with myself was, one of the things that helped me feel okay. Just spending a lot of time with myself and getting to know me more.
I think you've talked a lot about this, what I'm going to ask you about, and I think you just answered this question, but it reminded me I wanted to ask you. So I saw on your website it said that you were passionate about emotional and spiritual health. So is that what you're getting at when you're talking about, reading these books by, the Desmond Tutu or these kind of spiritual leaders, but also the personal work you were mentioning a lot?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think everybody accumulates wounds through their childhood and their early life, and leaving the church is a spiritual wound that needs to be healed. And we naturally, our brains have these magical abilities to like defend ourselves against these wounds as they're happening. But a lot of times what we do is we develop defense mechanisms that we don't need later. And we have to relearn how to be in the world when the world changes around us. And so, that's what I spend a lot of time doing, is like figuring out the motivations for the things that I'm doing, and where does this come from? Does this come from a healthy place, or is it coming from a scared place? and being more deliberate in my actions. And so, when I'm talking about emotional health, that's kind of what I'm talking about. And, the ability to engage in interpersonal relationships in healthy and nurturing ways. Those things are really important to me. And yeah, I read a lot of books about that stuff, and I have a lot of conversations. I mean, my Facebook page is pretty openly vulnerable. I'm talking a lot about the things that are going on inside of me and my struggles, and I've been very lucky to sort of curate a page where I have a lot of people who jump right in with that, which is really nice. So
yeah. I want to thank you for being so vulnerable and so open and telling your story, the difficult stuff too, everything in your story. Because I mean, as you know, it's just so powerful when you can tell your story, it frees other people to tell their stories, whether it be about deconversion or about trauma in their life or difficult things that they've gone through. And so I really appreciate you sharing your story and sharing what you went through. And I do think that it will encourage people encourage everybody who hears it, but people who've gone through that, I think, especially, it's very helpful. It's strengthening, strength in numbers and in hearing other people's stories. So
I hope so. I mean, this is probably the most publicly I've ever told my story. I'm not exactly a secret keeper, but, and I was very nervous about it. It is very scary, but I mean, I do hope it helps people to, and that's not to say that anyone has a responsibility to tell their story.
That's a good point.
But, even telling your story to yourself can be really powerful.
What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
People are welcome to visit my website. It's kristacox.me. And honestly, I tend to add lots of people on Facebook, unless you seem like a scary, abusive person. I tend to add people. So, and I'm available on Messenger on Facebook as well. I think it's Krista1203. And I'm more than happy to talk to people about things that they might be going through. I feel like I like to feel like a safe place for people to do that, and that helps me feel fulfilled in my life. So you're doing me a favor, actually.
Well, that's awesome. I love that, and thank you for being there for people and being available.
Yeah.
Well, Krista, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to do this interview. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Sue. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.